this is a book that I feel very close to. It engages a lot of the themes and topics that I also worked on in a similar period of time, also in Brazil and in the context of some other work we were doing. So I feel a lot of connections to it, and I'm very pleased to be involved in kind of helping push it out into the world. I think it deserves a lot of attention. So it's a beautifully written book. It covers a fascinating subject area, and I think deserves a lot of attention for that and for other reasons that I think we'll have an opportunity to talk about today. I will not do a lengthy introduction of the book or of Alex for that matter, but maybe just start by introducing Alex. He was an associate professor of anthropology at George Washington, and the author, in addition to Digital Pirates, of a book on Brazilian country music called River of Tears. Alex, do you want to?
Sure.
Run with that?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks. So, first of all, I just want to thank the Elliott School for the invitation to do this, and to thank Diane so much for all the work to set this up. There was a lot of back and forth, and our initial date for this, right, was the day after the election. Is that right? And I remember a very polite email from you saying, we're not getting a whole lot of RSVPs. So we rescheduled, and that turns out to have been a fortuitous decision. Thanks for that introduction, Joe. I was also very excited when you agreed to come and sort of be an interlocutor today. Joe is at the core of a lot of organizing of really empirically rigorous, but also publicly accessible work around piracy in the sort of early aughts that eventually came out on SSRC Press in 2011. Full disclosure, I was a small contributor to the Brazil section of that. Joe's current work is in the Open Syllabus project, which I really strongly encourage everyone to check out. This is a fantastic idea. And also he's published recently on work on shadow libraries and access to knowledge in global higher education. So Joe, thank you for being here today. What we plan to do is just kind of a Q&A. So Joe, I'm not sure where you want to start. I leave it in your capable hands.
Okay, well, I was going to tee up some questions that allow you to just explain some of the key themes and frameworks that underlie the book. And I think if people want to submit questions through the Q&A panel as we're talking, we'll do our best to address them in stream so that we don't get lost and move on to other things while there are active questions. So, maybe just to set the stage, I mean, can you say a few words about, both personal biography and intellectual biography, about how you maybe moved into Brazilian studies, began to work on music issues, and how that led you into an interest on questions of sort of piracy and informality more generally?
I mean, what brought me to Brazil in the first place was always music. And I've always thought about Brazil as a musical superpower. I mean, it's a superpower in many other ways, but the musical diversity and musical activity there, I just found and continue to find absolutely staggering. And that's what brought me to Brazil in the first place. And I want to point out something obvious at the beginning of talking today to contextualize this, which is, I have lived for a long time in Brazil, but I am very much, in the words of many of my interlocutors in Brazil, I am a gringo. So I just, I want to put a frame around what I am talking about. If there are points today in my talk where I seem to be indicting certain practices in Brazil, I've also wished to, indict them in the United States as well. We have plenty of issues with respect to intellectual property and so on. But anyway, that's how I ended up in Brazil. It was music. And with respect to piracy in particular, when I was doing research for the country music book, and I saw on the RSVP list, there are some folks who are from Brazil and some folks who have had experience from Brazil who are with us today. So the book is about música sertaneja, or música caipira, which is Brazilian country music. What you don't often hear about is it is one of the most, if not the most popular form of music in Brazil right now. And as I was doing research on that book, I wanted to figure out who was listening to it. So I was going to Billboard charts, MTV charts, licit kinds of places, and figuring out that 10 to 15% of the music sales in the country, illicit sales in the country, were about country music. But every day on the bus, I was in Campinas, which is about 2 million people northwest of Sao Paulo. And I would pass these enormous informal economies. And I would think, who's counting that? And so I noticed concurrent with this was 1998, not 1998, 99, 2000. First of all, no one was counting it. So people were kind of ignoring that as a cited musical circulation. But then this other strange thing was happening at exactly the same moment, which was that all of these anti-piracy NGOs were kind of sprouting like, mushrooms after rain. I don't know what the rain would be, maybe sort of neoliberal ethos or something. But at any rate, they're just sprouting. And they were talking about piracy. And as a practicing musician in Chicago at the time, I actually didn't know at first what people were talking about. And what are you talking about with piracy? And then I figured out, it's illicit or, it's unauthorized use. And so that's really how I got interested in piracy. I started going down to the Camilo. This was before it was politicized. These were by and large people with CD burners in their basements. This was not at that point organized crime. Absolutely not. These were folks who were renting kiosks from the city of Campinas that were numbered. They were built out of cinder blocks. They took credit cards. They were advocating for a health insurance plan. They very much saw themselves as entrepreneurs. And I went down and asked if it was okay if I sat and counted what musical genres were being sold. And they said, fine. So I counted country music records at a couple of these places for about a year and a half on and off. So that's really how it came about. It's some sort of relationship between fandom. And I actually discovered that a lot more, if you count the Camilo, at least in the state of Sao Paulo, at that time, at least, there were a lot more people listening to country music and música sertaneja than were showing up in the listed numbers. But the other thing that I noticed was the popularity numbers were being ignored by the industry. And it seems like it would be so easy to set up a scheme to count what people were listening to in the pirate economy. It would not be complicated. I'm sorry, it just wouldn't. But at the same time, they were getting this hyper scrutiny about, muzzling musicians and keeping musicians from earning their intellectual property. And so there was this weird, that's the analytical term in anthropology. There was this disjuncture between hyper scrutiny and complete elision and ignoring and sort of hyper policing and just pretending that it didn't exist. And that's what I set out to kind of describe in the book. I wanted to figure out, why is this happening? Why is this disjuncture taking place? And that was the big puzzle I kind of set out to solve.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking back about some of the work our friends and partners were doing around the same time, I mean, it feels like that this issue of Brazil being both incredibly rich musically, but only having a portion of that musical production captured through the formal music economy was it was an obvious sort of object to think through, right? And
Yeah.
you referenced some of the work on Technobrega in the book, which became a really a touchstone for thinking about alternative ways of organizing a musical economy.
Yeah.
I don't know how many points of contact there were between Technobrega and country music, but just generally this was, I think, circa 2005, 2008, 2010, a very significant and, for people paying attention from an anthropological perspective, interesting problem to unpack.
Yeah. I mean, there was that pretty famous piece of work by Oana Castro and Ronaldo Lemos on the Technobrega that I think is the one you're citing. Yeah. And for those that haven't followed that particular case, what they studied was this economy where the physical units, the sale of the physical units, was not what the revenue stream was about. That the business model was based around distributing these physical units to get people to show up to shows, and they would buy tickets to shows and come to shows. And of course, describing it as a kind of a mass scene the way it was in parts of Brazil at that point, I think was new. And then I think it became very familiar to those of us who were musicians. I mean, now, my band, what we record is not, it's not about the sales. It's about getting shows and about getting people to come to shows. So I think that business model has become something which, perhaps, started in Brazil and kind of circulated out from there. but certainly one of the things that emerged in looking at these quote unquote pirate spaces was that there were these, very different business models afoot. And what I think became increasingly true, and Joe, you actually, I think, know this stuff better than I do, but is, at this point in the musical economy, those who could profit from the sale of physical units were really in a minority. And I think that's still the case. I mean, I know a lot of folks who, try and make money from streaming, and it's not real. So anyway, this is in that sort of, I do place my work in that ecosystem, and I'm very much indebted to folks like, Ronaldo and Ona and Pedro Mizukami also in Brazil, who are doing work on those kinds of musical paradigms. And I guess what your question also suggests too is that there's something about sound and piracy that I think there's a confluence there that's important.
So, I enjoy the way that runs through much of the book, even when the book moves away from the question of sort of music, and there's a running thread about the experience of music, the product and the production of music that that I think. I mean, I read it back into your earlier work on country, but it's clear that that's it's an important lens for your thinking. I wonder if you could talk about what I perceive as the other kind of main lens or main entry point into these questions, and it introduces a kind of a different axis of for your analysis across the chapters. And that's the sort of informal market. So and I make it the pronunciation of Camilo.
Yeah, the Camilo, yeah.
Okay.
Or Camilo.
Camilo. Okay. Well, so I mean, you obviously have a lot of love for the Camilo, right? that
I do.
Runs throughout the book, and really provides an interesting way of thinking about the connection between the first chapters, which are primarily about media piracy, things, and the media economy of CDs, DVDs, other kinds of optical discs, and the shift toward the phone economy, right? Where
Yep.
the Camilo is the common, the common space through which those two economies develop. So can you set the stage for talk a bit about the Camilo and how that kind of attracted your interest as a researcher?
I mean, I think this is another place where it is important for me to implot myself in the research, which was as a gringo anthropologist who had been brought up in a particular part of Toronto, and then lived in Cambridge for a little while in the United Kingdom, and then particular parts of Chicago. I had not encountered what we can gloss as informal economies. And I just want to bracket here that I have real trouble with the distinction between formal and informal. I think it's just really an inadequate way to parse the distinction between those two things. And I'm happy to talk about that if there's economists present or whatever, but it's a problematic distinction. And yet I find myself continuing to use it. I had not encountered economies of this type. And, the first time I made it to the Camilodromo in Campinas, I was absolutely flabbergasted by the kinds of products that were available. And, I should note at that time that the family that, I lived with then, and who continues to be my caretakers in many ways, and did a better job of taking care of me than my Canadian family. Substantially. I had sort of two brothers who were contemporaneous to me in Brazil, and they spent a lot of time sort of taking me to the Camelo and showing me around. That I hadn't seen that kind of profusion of products before. I should just throw in another shout out here. Rosana Pinheiro Machado is unable to be with us. She's in the United Kingdom right now. And the time is tough for her, but she's done this amazing work on the sort of the link between products manufactured in China, filtered through Paraguay, largely in Brazil, and then kind of filtered out to the rest of the country. But to sort of cut to the chase of your question, that the Camilo became a site in which digital products, digital texts in the form of these CDs and DVDs, but also digital products began to really circulate. And in some sense, Brazil's capacity to participate in this kind of digital space was mediated through these Camelo because they were providing affordable, truly affordable products, licit products in Brazil. And I use that licit term advisedly, are taxed really, really highly. And so this becomes important with cellular phones. But at the time, it was important for computers. It wasn't just about getting DVDs and CDs. It was also about getting access to computers and computer parts to play those texts. And so these become incredibly important sites for, Brazil's capacity to participate in the digital economy, period, and participate in forms of digital textuality. The last thing I'll just say in response to your question is the reason I feel like the distinction between formal and informal is really problematic here was because so many of these markets were highly formalized. I mean, as I mentioned before, paying with credit card, some health insurance plans and unionization. They, were hooked up to wireless networks as soon as that became available. These folks viewed themselves as entrepreneurs, and said, "I'm providing, what is capitalism but a way to provide products cheaply? I don't understand why I'm, I'm being criticized here. I'm providing this product more cheaply than illicit manufacturers." And I think it's in, I'll just say quickly that I think it's in the SSRC study where you all ran the numbers on the dark night, right? And calibrated for local incomes. And it was determined that, were you to buy a licit copy of The Dark Knight in Brazil at the time that was run, it would run you the equivalent of about 85 US dollars. I think it was $411 in India, right? But if you take the pirated copy, that it was actually closer to about 15 bucks. So piracy strikes me as a pricing issue in many ways. Anyway, that was a long answer, but informal economy is staggeringly important to tying the whole project together.
So just thinking about that shift again, I mean, the Camilo provides a nice way of connecting these two moments in economies. The kind of the optical disc market of say 2000 to 2000. Maybe 12, 15.
Yep.
I mean, it begins to dry up as soon as digital services become the main form of consumption of music and movies. Sure, there's a question. We'll come back to that in a second. Then, once kind of the phone gray market and gray market cellular services take over, that Camilo begins to serve that set of needs too. But I wonder if you can. So this is where you end up. The work ends up intersecting with different kinds of regimes of policing. So the Camilo provides a certain kind of space for the police to operate, right? It's a place where you can engage in very kind of obvious hands-on performative policing, rousting out the DVD vendors or potentially the cell phone vendors. But in the music economy, once that dries up as a subject of kind of street policing, the issues shift toward internet policy. They shift toward kind of higher order policy issues that aren't as directly connected to boots on the ground kind of policing. And you make similar. There's an analogous set of problems when you get to cell phone policing. Right, or the problem of regulation more than policing of the cell phone market. Can you talk a bit about so our overlapping work had a lot to do with optical discs, the DVD markets, the forms of policing that were really about a kind of performance both for the MPAA and the sort of the international industry organizations on the one hand. You introduce some other angles about just kind of the the role of the police on the Brazilian street as a kind of enforcer of social and racial hierarchies.
Yep.
Can you begin to unpack that a little bit and then talk about how that changes in the context of the cell phone era and the cell phone market?
I mean, it's an ongoing question for me. I go back and forth on this book between thinking that, I've told the story that has now come to a close, and thinking that that story, and it seems to me this is part of where your question is leading, right? Like, is this over? And I think in a sense, as you and I were actually talking about this the other day, that in terms of sort of North American, European, and kind of Japanese corporate business models, the moment may have passed. But one of the things I noticed in terms of the kind of performativity of policing over the time that I was there was just, I mean, first of all, there's a tremendous privatization of policing that is of incredible concern, right? When you have the Motion Picture Association of America and the Recording Industry Association of America um, incentivizing local police forces in Brazil to scrutinize something and providing kind of logistical support for that. That to me is a serious concern. I mean, how would we feel about that in the United States if our police forces were being incentivized by, anyway, that to me is kind of one set of questions. But to me, I just felt like the policing was so spectacularly, and I do mean spectacularly, as you pointed out, ineffective, because what was happening was that these highly visible markets in big places like Campinas, the Camilódromo in Campinas was where it was all focalized in one place, or the big markets in Grande São Paulo, in the city of São Paulo, where they really fell with force in the kind of late aughts, early teens. The effect of that was kind of like whacking a ball of mercury in a way. So, what it did, instead of rooting out piracy, which may have been the ostensible goal, was it made piracy sort of deeper and more intimate, because it pressed these individual vendors out into residential neighborhoods. So it wasn't these clusters of people hanging out in these highly visible places. You had your person who would hang out outside your building. So it really diffused the situation, and it did it at a moment in which I would have really thought, because of the speed of internet penetration and the sort of scale of internet penetration, particularly in a state like Sao Paulo, which is very quote unquote developed from that sort of metric, that I really would have thought that some of the physical units would have dropped off. So I'm not clear how important the physical units continue to be. And I'll say I had a trip planned to go back next year. I'm writing a book about punk rock and policing between 1978 and 1982. But so I guess one of the sort of themes here is real ineffectiveness of policing. If your real intention is to root out policing, just kind of rooting it out at those visible locations isn't tremendously effective. But I think the other thing about policing that I was really anxious to get at was, in some of the folks that we hung out with at conferences, some of the sort of copy left folks, there was a discourse that policing could only be happening in these places if it was the result of bribery. That was really the kind of the only, it must be these corporations paying people off. And indeed, certainly in the 90s and the early aughts, there were some explicit bribes going on, and some of that switched to like, oh, look, a new fridge for the police station. So was still some of that going on. But I was definitely interested in locating some of those policing discourses in a Brazilian context, and looking at how there might be some kind of locally Brazilian reasons for policing. And so, one of the common discourses I heard when I first got to Brazil, when Brazilians were trying to kind of orient me to Brazil, was to say, look, invoking some of these discourses of mixture. And so that was a way of talking about the country to someone like me that didn't know it particularly well. But there's another side of this, which is about fears of what happens when mixture goes too far. And I think we're seeing, and this too far, by the way, is not my term, but I think the sort of some of the authoritarian impulses in contemporary Brazilian politics is part of what we're seeing there. So there were some localized reasons for engaging in the policing, aside from just financial incentives. And I was at pains to try and describe those as well, so that it wasn't just sort of writing off. I mean, I did not feel good about the policing. It was capricious, frequently violent. It was, making the lives of an already precarious group of cultural producers in Brazil all that much more precarious. And also there were some local reasons for why it was happening. It wasn't just kind of this foreign imposition. I'm not sure if I've answered your question.
Well, I don't think it was a very pointed question, so you've you've done a good job of talking around it.
Policing.
Yeah. There is a question in the queue. Can you see that? Do
Sure.
you want to field it?
I want to make
Should we
sure
read it
that
out loud? Can everybody see that question?
could everyone see that? Or so this is a question from Richard. Um, Richard Grinker, discomfort with the formal informal dualism. So, Hart is I believe, the person, actually an anthropologist. I credit this to economists earlier, but who began to use the term distinction between formal and informal in the African context. And I think, Richard, I want to make sure I'm understanding your question. And there's a bunch of other questions popping up here, which I want to make sure I get to. But and I think when that distinction was introduced, I think it had more efficacy, particularly in the African context, than it did now. I mean, my problem with it was precisely that they did seem to be dialogically related to one another. That the and let me give you a small sort of ethnographic vignette around that. So the customary discourse in what I call IP maximalists, intellectual property maximalists, is the notion that when someone buys a pirated copy, that is a lost licit sale. And Joe's work has done, to my mind, more than anyone else to really empirically, definitively debunk that myth. People who pirate a lot of music also buy a lot of music. But what I noticed in the Brazilian context, and this is with respect to sort of distinctions between formal and informal, was that folks would want to sample a CD and listen to it and think, is this a one-hit wonder? Because we've all bought a record where, we heard okay, I am an old man. I bought records as a kid where I thought, well, that's a great single. And then I bought it and I thought, there's nothing else on this record. Well, piracy is a way for you to sort of inoculate yourself against that. You can buy the record, you can listen to it, and you say, oh yeah, it's deep. There's a lot of tracks here. Maybe I will go out and buy the licit copy. Or when sort of giving a licit copy as a gift. And so I think, my discomfort with the formal informal label is not only that lots of things about the ostensibly informal economy appeared to be highly informalized, but also that they're just so codependent upon one another. So I hope that goes some distance to answering your questions. Susan Johnson asks, is this music popular internationally? And how does that affect the various markets you've talked about? Yeah, well, música sertaneja is not popular internationally. There were some experiments doing Spanish language translations for other parts of the music economy in Latin America, but that is a music that did not travel and so was not really pirated much outside of Brazil. But with respect to your question in terms of sort of international flows, there were plenty. I mean, hip hop was really kind of exploding in Brazil at that moment. There was a real kind of awareness of the inadequacies of the myth of racial democracy, and hip hop was part of that kind of awareness was happening at that moment. And plenty of hip hop was being sort of pirated in Brazil. Once again, though, it wasn't, Brazil is a really interesting musical economy because, between 80 and 90% of the music that circulates in Brazil was made in Brazil for a Brazilian audience. So yeah, sure, there's a lot of Western music that circulates there, but it's not doesn't account for anything like the largest amount of it. I hope that's adequate.
Yeah,
Eduardo
it's
Vasconcelos.
very different in that respect from film and especially software, where almost
Right,
all
good
of the
point.
products are international products. They're priced at international levels. There's no domestic producer market, comparable to the musician, the public of producing musicians. So musicians almost always act as the primary protagonists in the
Yeah,
IP debates in these
yeah,
countries, because you can point, they're sympathetic figures and can be mobilized easily. Always feel like they're being ripped off enough money. They're always, it's we saw that again and again in the studies we did in different countries, that the artist groups leaned and IP industry groups leaned heavily on domestic musicians, especially to be the kind of representative of failed compliance with IP regimes.
Sorry, we
Yeah,
have a few questions that were submitted through the chat. Do you mind if I just read them out?
no.
Because they won't be visible. Okay. So one audience member asked whether policing really forced out piracy, or did piracy all just go right back? Was the policing sustained enough to snuff the big markets?
I mean, Joe can answer that question better from a global perspective, but my perspective in Brazil was that, and I have anecdotal proof of this. I don't have empirical proof in terms of number of physical units, but what I observed was that the policing did absolutely nothing to affect the numbers. Once again, it pushed it out into this more kind of diverse space. And to give a quick example of that, one of my I refer to as my Brazilian family. He said, Thiago is his name. He said, I need to take you to this particular spot in Campinas because you've been spending all this time in the Camilódromo downtown, but I need to take you to this other place. So we got in his car and he drove me around to these markets in places in Brazil called periferia. And there were these quite large street side economies that had grown up there in the years since. So once upon a time, a lot of this was focused in the bus station. A lot of these folks were going through the bus station and they would pick up their movie on the way home, the way, I at the time would still maybe have gone to Blockbuster. But it kind of moved. So the short answer to the question is no. I mean, if I'm understanding the question correctly, the policing, if the intention of the policing, and I'm actually throwing that into problematization here, if the intention of the policing was to stop piracy, no, it did not do that. If the intention of the policing was in part to demonstrate to an international community that, look, we are taking this seriously. Please, United States Trade Representative, let us out of the naughty chair. I didn't put it into the book, but the United States Trade Representative's special 301 process is, I'm sorry, I may offend people on the call here, but to my mind, an arm of corporate production in the United States, they would plagiarize in their USTR publications, plagiarize whole sections of briefings from the industry. And so, Brazil was in this position of trying to get itself out of this kind of scrutiny. I think that's part of what the policing was about.
Yeah, certainly that was the framework we settled on, and I was part of what interested me about your richer account of kind of the domestic context of policing was that it introduced other motives, right? There's domestic politics around policing that has relatively little to do with IP in particular, but it's much more about social order and these places being, the Camilo being a kind of site of potential social disruption that requires a police presence to kind of reassure people is something that I learned from having knowing the police narrative pretty well. That was an interesting different angle on the role of policing in that context from my perspective.
It seems to be that this, in some sense, indexes Eduardo Vasconcelos' question. I know this. I know, Diane, there's some other questions that may have come up in the chat that I can't see, but he asks about Bolsonaro, and and for those who are not up on Brazilian politics, Bolsonaro is an extremely right. I don't know how to describe him in language that feels polite for a broad audience, but kind of a Brazilian form of Trump. And I think one of the things that I occasionally heard when I was writing the country music book in connection with a conservative rural politics was, and once again, I want to note that tremendous problems with American politics right now too. So I want to contextualize this, but I heard some nostalgia for the dictatorship from time to time, which in Brazil was 1964 to 1985. And, there are people, Rosana Pinheiro Machado is one of them, who's writing about this and who's a lot more qualified to speak on this subject than I am. But, those currents of nostalgia for authoritarianism, I think, are part of why we're in this moment right now with, as we are, this sort of lamentable moment. I see a question, I think, from Sean. Diane, was that one you were going to read out?
No,
Did you really force it out, or did it all just go right back to the central locations?
yes.
I think you did answer.
Okay, was policing sustained enough to snuff it out at the big markets? I mean, Sean, in the last chapter, I'll just add a tiny bit more onto that and just say in the last chapter, I talk about a transformation at the big visible markets where they became these sites where I had seen a lot of physical units of CDs and DVDs and computer parts became really a lot about cell phones. And there were a number of different kinds of cell phones. There were sort of, cell phones where the duty hadn't been paid. And there were cell phones that may have been stolen and reconditioned. And then, there were Chinese copies. One of my favorite was the iPhone, which had, early on had 2 spots for SIM cards, which was genius, and the capacity to watch, analog television. So I did see a transformation in those markets. But, to your question, Sean, it wasn't just about the disappearance of piracy. It was about different things getting pirated. And there seems to be some more permissibility around the piracy of cellular phones at that point. So kind of yes and kind of no, I think.
But to address a very similar kind of market failure to bring products, that people feel that they want and need to market in an affordable way. I mean, it's very, it's the same dynamic. It's certainly a product shift, and one that, I mean, I was interested in the arguments about kind of the different ways in which cell phones inhabit daily life, and that creates a less much stronger resentment against the failures of the illicit market to provide them, and consequently less and maybe less internationally driven pressure on police to actively go in and kind of roust out these marketplaces. Which, the more physical the good, the easier that is to do in a sense. So it's not. In a way, it's a more policeable item than the old DVD economy, but there's less pressure to do that because it's seen as basically an essential service, as I understand your argument.
Yeah, I mean, the history of phones in Brazil is fascinating, and there are Brazilians, as with all of these topics, there are Brazilians who've written more eloquently about these topics than I have. But landlines were incredibly expensive in the 1970s and 1980s, and in a sort of a guise before his kind of neoliberal presidency, Fernando Henrique Cardoso wrote this classical essay now on associated dependent development, in which he talked about this whole notion of kind of developmentally, quote unquote, skipping phases. And so I heard a lot of engagements with the notion that Brazil hadn't fully implanted landlines, and it had kind of skipped, and this is not my language once again, but many of my interlocutors, it had skipped this phase into cell phones. But there was almost a kind of a corporate subsidy for the variety of ways of coming across a cell phone, because when you showed up at Claro or whatever, wherever your plan was, for quite a long time they did not ask where you got the phone. They just put it on your plan. And so that you had a plan with them, that the phone could use data, was more than acceptable. And so this is where just the space becomes so complex. It's like, well, we're not going to ask if this is a pirated phone. We don't care if it's a pirated phone. You're going to sign up for our service. And there were several attempts, which I document in the book, to try and sort of program the infrastructure to sift for piratical phones and shut them down. And then the last chapter in the book is all about the anxieties that arise around pirated phones and how people are worried about their phones being cloned. Not a spectacularly common experience, actually, but really exploded in a kind of anxiety in the mediascape in the later parts of the period that I was there, that, because we have these pirated phones, we are more prone to have our phones cloned by criminal gangs in Brazil. And so I get into the whole notion of sort of criminality. I see a question from Dylan Craig, thinking about other piratical eras. There's often a link between the piratical back end and the authority figures of society, colonial governments keeping pirates close to ensure happy consumers, right? This seems to operate above and possibly at odds with the police pirate dynamic. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point. First of all, thank you for introducing the importance of history here. And along those lines, I really drew so heavily on Adrian John's work about the history of piracy and the way in which we seem to be kind of cyclically working through these technological anxieties. We were going to, lose everything in response to print. 1471 brought these conflicts. There's a fantastic translation, Edith Grossman's relatively new translation of Don Quixote, which I've been spending time with. And there's this great chapter in Don Quixote where they're going through his library. And basically the argument that they're making is print destroyed this man's mind, these romance novels. So, in some ways we've been seeing this for a long time. But it also, in terms of the historical picture, really raises the distinction between, licit and illicit pirates, right? Like, Captain Kidd ends up getting killed, but really, does he in fact have letters of marque that make this legitimate, or does it not? I mean, I think one thing that's clear, and Joe, your work has spoken to this, but piracy for a long time has, one way to view this is sort of intellectual property law comes first and piracy kind of comes second, but actually Adrian Johns puts that the other way around and says that piracy is actually a lot of what's generating the creativity around these different business models, which to my mind is sort of is borne out by this. And Joe, one of the things that always fascinated me, and I can't remember his name, and anyway, we may not want to share, but one of the lawyers who would show up at some of these events worked for Best Buy. And so there was an interesting way in which these corporate interests actually didn't always match up with each other, because as a representative of Best Buy, he wasn't categorically opposed to piracy, because a lot of the devices you could circulate your MP3s on, made use of pirated MP3s. So he always had occupied this interesting position, definitely corporate power, but not, is piracy such a bad thing? Maybe not for Best Buy.
I mean, the example of that to me is, part of it's one of the great stories of the past 50 years is pirated business software. The modern world is built on pirated business software. Handful of companies that have global standards for, word processing, kind of basic business tools. And they were very they were very tolerant of piracy in middle and low income markets because it guaranteed them a monopoly. Pirated copies of Microsoft Word and Windows kept out free open source competitors because they were so easy, and they had very powerful network effects. And then the business model is to go in after the fact and begin to enforce against the largest businesses, and then to work your way down the chain to the point where it's no longer economical to enforce. It's very explicitly the business model for Microsoft around the world for 25 years.
To get people hooked on your operating system.
Yeah, hook their potential clients. It was making a virtue out of necessity because they couldn't easily enforce in those markets. But it was a very viable business model, and piracy was absolutely central to how they envisioned their global their status as a global standard.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And with respect to a sort of, ostensibly uneasy reliance between licit businesses and piracy. And I would also just throw, I mean, I've been talking a fair bit about his work, but Adrian Johns has a great piece called Piracy as a Business Force that talks about the way in which we hear contemporary rock and roll has so much to do with pirate radio stations that, were playing stuff when BBC4 wouldn't play it. But then that ends up being co-opted to actually a very conservative politics of musical circulation now. Eduardo Vasconcelos, another great question here about book piracy in Brazil and the dynamics of that. And once again, I want to call out the fact that there are Brazilian scholars who've written on this. And by name, I just want to mention the work of Pablo Hortelado, who has done a ton of work, really empirically rich and accessible work on book piracy. Specifically looking at educational textbooks. And one of his studies looks at how public funds get used to produce a lot of textbooks, but then those textbooks get privatized and sold for very, very high amounts, high dollar values. And so, what does piracy look like in that context? I mean, one of the most vitriolic fights I witnessed happened at a fascinating event where the public defender in São Paulo brought together sort of left-wing, open source, Creative Commons activists together with representatives from the intellectual property industry in Brazil to sort of co-present on the same panels. And Pablo Hortelado presented his work on how difficult it is to talk about piracy in a context in which public funds are getting appropriated by private interests to sell textbooks. And the representative who was there from the Brazilian books, booksellers, it was just a shouting match. I mean, I think one of the complexities there with this, for your question, Eduardo, is that because for some of the Brazilian books that are being sold, the markets are comparatively small. There are some deleterious effects of piracy in those markets, and that's something I heard from Brazilian authors about and struggled with. And I think perhaps for that reason, I heard similar things from some Brazilian authors, usually of academic texts, that were similar to what I was hearing from music, which is, okay, it's not about the physical units. And I would note that my book, Digital Pirates, I would say here, if you want to buy a copy from Stanford University Press, great. I also need to point out to you, it's been pirated. You can get yourself a free PDF, from one of the sites. And for me, my editors at Stanford University Press probably wouldn't be happy with me saying this, but I'd rather be read and cited than paid for the book. So anyway, I think Eduardo, the other reason this is a great question is you need to, and this has come up a little bit today, but you need to think about this a little differently according to the context, right? Are we talking about business software? Are we talking about films? Are we talking about music where production costs are different circulation sizes? There's a terrific story, a very interesting story in Brazil about the film, which I think in English is translated as Elite Squad. Some of you may have seen the film Tropa and it's actually a pretty interesting movie about corruption in policing. And I, by the way, use the term corruption very advisedly as a North American scholar talking about another location, because we've got plenty of corruption in North American politics. But that film was viewed, and someone on the call right now may have the numbers at their fingertips. It was reviewed a staggering number of times, in part because the film circulated that first weekend in the pirate economy. I mean, it was hugely popular. And fascinatingly, the director who went on to direct Narcos on Netflix, which is problematic, for other reasons, which we can come to, very problematic. But he ended up, for the next film, making only physical copies of the film, not letting it out of basically drove it around in an armed van for also trying to prevent piracy, which had been the whole sort of cause for the success here. So anyway, Eduardo, thanks for asking that question, because it points to the importance of thinking about it in different forms of mediation, different modalities.
So, we have only 5 minutes left. I ask, what's next? Where does this work lead?
Right.
Did you hear me?
I did. Yeah. Sorry. Every time my neighbor uses her microwave, I experience a blip.
I got a blip too. That's why I asked.
Oh, okay. Maybe it was, somewhere in the ether out there. I mean, for me, I advance, and I don't want to disappear down the rabbit hole. And as an anthropologist, I can do that. But, I advance kind of a theory of digital textuality. So this starts out being a book about piracy, and it ends up being about, what it means to circulate texts digitally. And I end up talking about the kind of the digital sublime, that there are anxieties that we face as users of digital technology about what the kind of limits of ourselves are. And this is part of the motivation for policing of piracy, right? Like, we become anxious about the potential for ourselves to circulate beyond boundaries. And it's both sort of great and also sort of nerve-wracking as well. So I want to do some more work on that. And I'm doing this study with Joshua Bell and Joel Kuipers. Joshua Bell, curator of globalization at the Smithsonian Joel Kuiper is a linguistic anthropologist here at GW, on teenage cell phone use in Washington, D.C. And so some of my thinking about digital textuality is playing out in that context as well. We've got some stuff coming out now talking about that and authoritarianism. And then the other direction that has kind of sort of borne more fruit for me is thinking about policing in a global context, and kind of put different eras of policing into global and local kind of contextual frames. And I mentioned quickly that I'm doing this book on the history of policing punk rock in Brazil between 1978 and 1982, and punk rock in São Paulo. And so I'm thinking a lot about the kind of deeply racialized ways in which policing practices and languages are getting enforced. So I think those are some of the new directions. And then, Joe, you and I talked about this a little bit when we touched base the other day, but I have this ongoing question about the extent to which this story about piracy is over, or whether it's kind of an ongoing story. And I think as internet penetration has gotten greater and legal has become cheap and manageable, the call for physical units has become less. But there's a meme that one of my students sent me the other day that was something like, someone in 2011, and they took off their pirate hat. It was a pirate hat, and they said, "Bye, old friend," and they put them into a trunk. And then, sort of around the monetization of streaming sources, I think it was, 2019, 2020, they went back to the trunk and got out their pirate hat, in response to, The Mandalorian, I think, kind of started it. But all these monetized streams saying, "Oh, it's time to get out the pirate hat again." So whether piracy becomes as central to business decisions, I don't know. But I think the story is not entirely over.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah. Or there are other. Oh, someone has asked me what the instrument is behind me. That is an Indonesian 2-stringed guitar, which I found two of them at a rummage sale. And you could argue that placing a cultural artifact on a wall partakes of a form of piracy in a way. Other questions or comments? Sort of watching the chat and also the.
I think that's it.
Okay, so I want to do one thing before we go, which is I want to throw into the syllabus project. Experiencing a small crash here. I don't know if you can hear my son screaming upstairs. But just as a sort of a shout out for some of the work that Joe is doing right now, so folks can see this syllabus project. And issues of intellectual property very much come up here because as I understand it, Joe, you've been recruiting people to submit syllabi to this, and there's always some anxieties about this syllabus is my intellectual property. Am I going to submit it for open source kinds of scrutiny? Is that accurate?
Yeah. Very few. We've got 10 million syllabi, of which about 1,500 are donated. So.
Right. And I think intellectual property probably plays a role in those anxieties, right? So
no, it's just if you ask faculty to do something, they don't do it. We just
what? No, that's not true.
That's been the main issue. People are generally pretty willing to share their document. Anyway, this is a longer story, and I'd be happy to get into it. It is 4, though. I don't want to, draw this out into a topic that nobody signed up for. But
but nonetheless, this is a really important topic because one of the partial motivations for this project, as I understand it, was to give folks credit for articles and books that get assigned a lot in syllabi. So it comes back to intellectual property issues. It's all the same topic. Anyway, thank you to those of you